Not all traits are created equal. Some tend to be given more weight than others. Solomon Asch was the first psychologist to note that some traits are more central. In other words, they exert a more powerful effect on impressions because they imply the presence of other traits. The trait list study is a classic study he conducted in the 40s, wherein he gave two groups of participants the same list of traits to describe a person, except that one single trait was changed in the list, and that trait was warm or cold. In the middle of the list, one trait only. Far more positive impressions were formed when the list included the trait warm as opposed to cold. When other traits in the list were changed, for instance, polite changed to blunt, this did not eliminate or even reduce the effect of this central trait. So Asch concluded that some traits are more central. In other words, they exert a more powerful effect on impressions because they imply the presence of more other traits. So what traits do you think are the most powerful? The advent of the computer and a statistical procedure called factor analysis brought about the discovery of the big 5 personality traits. Factor analysis is a statistical technique for arranging data points into a two-dimensional space. With traits represented by dots in such a space, psychologists were able to determine 5 main clusters of traits that best predict behavior overall. And these are called the Big 5. The Big 5 theory consists of these clusters. The first one is called neuroticism. Now, somebody is high in neuroticism. This means they are worried, insecure, and emotionally unstable. Now, if they're low on neuroticism or any of these that we talk about now, you can infer that by the opposite, right? So, for instance, with neuroticism, that would be someone who's not easily worried, who is basically secure and emotionally stable. The second one is extroversion. And if someone is high on extroversion, they tend to be outgoing, sociable, and talkative. Openness, sometimes thought of as open-mindedness. That's a good way to think of it. Okay? Somebody who's high on open-mindedness tends to be open to hearing about different ideas that are very different from their own. They're open to new experiences. They tend to be imaginative and prefer variety. Agreeableness is the next one. Someone who's high on agreeableness tends to be friendly, trusting, and cooperative. And then finally, conscientiousness. Now be careful about this. Sometimes students confuse this for consciousness, and that's very different. Consciousness. You know, conscientiousness does not mean that somebody is more aware or more conscious about certain things. Okay? It means that they are more careful, more organized, dependable, more detail-oriented. Conscientiousness. Here's a great tip, a great way to remember the Big 5 personality traits. Just think of the word ocean, O-C-E-A-N, to represent each of the Big 5. Now, which of the Big 5 do you think Asch was tapping into with cold and warm in his study? What do you think? And the answer to that would be agreeableness. Here's another question for you. What type of impressions do you think are the most lasting? If you guessed first impressions, you are right. As the saying goes, first impressions are lasting. When faced with disconfirming evidence, we tend to stick to our first impressions, information we learned about somebody early on. Why? What makes them so powerful? Actually, there are many reasons. One is primacy effects. Remember Solomon Asch? In another classic experiment by Asch, way back in the 60s, one group of participants learned that a person possessed a list of traits, starting with intelligence and ending with envious, while others learned the exact same list, but in the reverse order. The first group formed a significantly more favorable impression of the person. This order study is an example of primacy effects. Information we learn first has a larger effect than later information. Why does the information we learn first have more power? Well, a couple of reasons. First, perceivers form opinions early on, then pay less attention, thus give less weight to subsequent information. Second, the early information sets the framework for how we interpret later information. Based on your first impressions, the word proud can mean self-respecting or conceited. Critical can mean astute or picky, and impulsive can mean spontaneous or reckless. First impressions also glean power from the confirmation bias. The confirmation bias. Once we form a first impression of others, we actively seek and create information that verifies our first impression. In the Sticking to the Theory study by Anderson in 1980, the first group of participants read studies suggesting that risk takers make better firefighters than those who are cautious. The second group read stories suggesting the opposite, that cautious firefighters function the best. Next, participants were asked to come up with theories to support their opinion. The first group came up with theories like, he who hesitates loses. The second group came up with equally strong theories, like, look before you leap. Later, after forming these theories, when told the stories they read at the beginning were false and given a chance to change their theories, participants chose to stick to their theories instead. Apparently, it is easier to get people to build a theory than to tear it down. Yet another source of power of first impressions is confirmation hypothesis testing. Once we form a first impression, we tend to test it in a biased manner. So don't get these two confused, okay? Confirmation bias, right before this, reflects on how we form a theory, and confirmation hypothesis testing, how we test that theory. In the Coerced Confession study by Kaysen in 2003, some college students were coerced to commit a mock crime, in fact to steal $100 from a lab. Participants in the study were assigned to interrogate a suspect they were led to believe was either guilty or innocent. When they believed him to be guilty, they asked more incriminating questions, conducted more coercive interrogations, and tried harder to get him to confess. So once we form a theory, we have a tendency to test it in ways that are more likely to actually confirm it. Last but not least, we have the self-fulfilling prophecy, which goes like this. First impressions breed expectancies. So they prompt expectancies, and these expectancies then cause us to treat targets in a certain way, ways in which often produce the expected behavior. This helps to explain why negative first impressions are even more stubbornly persistent than positive ones. For example, say we form a first impression that Jim is rude, so we tend to avoid him, meaning we prevent ourselves from learning any disconfirming information. And even if we cannot avoid Jim, our rude expectancies of Jim cause us to treat him rather rudely, which in turn causes him to treat us rather rudely, therefore confirming our expectancies. Many stereotypes persist in the face of disconfirming evidence because of the self-fulfilling prophecy.